Hi guys, and a happy new year to you all. I hope you all had a fun and safe festive holiday. So today's episode is a special one. As you probably saw from the title, we are talking about the best and the worst horror movies of 2021. I will also be ranking them, starting off with the worst and then working my way up to what I consider to be the best one. But before we get started with the ranking, just a quick disclaimer that I feel I should mention, and you will probably notice once we get into talking about the movies, I didn't watch all of the horror movies released in 2021. I didn't watch them all because A, the cost, B, feeling comfortable in the cinema at some points in the year, and C, because I didn't want to watch them all. I love horror very, very much, but that does not mean that I'm going to want to watch every single horror movie that is ever released. However, I did watch quite a few of the horror movies, which we will talk about in this episode, and some of them are absolutely amazing, and I'm really excited to talk about them. And as always, remember that this ranking is just based off of my own choices, my own thoughts, my own opinions on these movies. It doesn't necessarily follow that it's going to be the same as your ranking. Okay, so let's get this ranking going. Starting off at the bottom, scraping the barrel, the worst of the worst from 2021, in my opinion, is There's Someone Inside Your House. After moving to live with her grandmother in Hawaii, a teenager must confront her past after fellow students at her school are murdered. I'm sure there's a lot of you out there that will have really enjoyed this film, and I'm not so blind to its qualities that I can't understand why. There is a bit of confusion on my part as to why I don't love it. Some of my favourite horror films are I Know What You Did Last Summer and Scream, and this has a lot of the ingredients that should make it a film that I really love. But this one just didn't work for me. I didn't really engage with the characters. I found it quite boring. But I will say that some of the shots in this film were really beautiful, and it did have some pretty good cinematography throughout. But basically, the journey I went on with this film was I went from disliking the characters and the way that they spoke to each other to being bored, to kind of liking it a little bit for a little while, and then checking out completely because I'd figured out who the killer was, and as I didn't like the characters, there was no longer any interest for me. And then by the end of it, I was just sat rolling my eyes at how cheesy and predictable the ending was. Next up, we have Great White. When a seaplane is destroyed in a freak accident, 5 people find themselves drifting on a raft. At the mercy of the tide and with no hope of rescue, the helpless situation takes a horrifying turn when they are terrorised by a ravenous great white. So definitely not one of the best movies of the year. Pretty bad. Most shark movies are, with a few exceptions. But I did go into it expecting it to be bad, and I think because my expectations were so low, I was able to be surprised by how it wasn't actually as bad as I expected it to be. I mean, yes, it's cheesy, it's predictable, the acting is not the best, but I did enjoy how we had 2 final girls and they survived through helping each other and working together. There is also the point that I touched upon in my November Letterboxd recap, that I have this inner turmoil within myself that I love shark movies, but I'm also very aware of how irresponsible they are in their portrayal of sharks. You know, they mislead, they misrepresent these creatures. So I watch it, but I don't know if I should be watching them. Next up, we have Army of the Dead, which is the Zack Snyder film that was released on Netflix. After a zombie outbreak in Las Vegas, a group of mercenaries take the ultimate gamble and venture into the quarantine zone in hopes of pulling off an impossible heist. So I was actually looking forward to this film. I like zombie films when they're done well. I know that the market is oversaturated at the moment thanks to the success of The Walking Dead, but I think when they're done well, I do enjoy them, and I wanted to check this one out. But no, I was really disappointed with this one. This one was not brilliant. It was a lot of show, I think, with not much substance. But I did give it the 2 stars, and to be honest with you, those 2 stars have been earned mostly by the beautiful opening credit scene. If I was going to recommend anything about this film to somebody, it would be to just watch the opening credit scene and leave it there. It is this wonderful little self-contained story within it, and I absolutely love the cover of Elvis's Viva Las Vegas that they play over the top. Okay, this one could annoy some people, and I'm a little bit nervous about putting it in the worst, but next up we have Halloween Kills. The nightmare isn't over as unstoppable killer Michael Myers escapes from Laurie Strode's trap to continue his ritual bloodbath. Injured and taken to the hospital, Laurie fights through the pain as she inspires residents of Haddonfield to rise up against Myers. Taking matters into their own hands, the Strode women and other survivors form a vigilante mob to hunt down Michael and end his reign of terror once and for all. So, like most people, I was really looking forward to Halloween Kills, and I know there are a lot of people that do love it, and I can understand why. There are definitely aspects of this film that I love too. I love that we saw the Myers house again, the flashback, Loomis, the adult Lindsay Wallace. They were all great, loved them. But the writing, the dialogue, and the stupid character decisions really weakened the film for me, in my opinion. Which is such a shame because I was really disappointed with this one. It's definitely one of the goriest Halloween films and probably has the highest death toll of any of them. I would have to double check that, but it's got the carnage candy for you gorehounds out there. But I'm still looking forward to Halloween Ends, and hopefully with retrospect, Halloween Ends will make Halloween Kills a better movie. Next up, we have Till Death, starring Megan Fox. Emma is stuck in a stale marriage to Mark and is surprised when he whisks her away to their secluded lake house for a romantic evening on their 10th anniversary. But everything changes the next morning when she finds herself handcuffed to Mark's dead body. Trapped and isolated in the dead of winter, Emma learns this is only the beginning of Mark's twisted plan, and to survive she must fight the hired killers coming to finish her off. So even though this film is in my worst section, I did give it 3 stars, and that's because when I initially watched it, I had a good time with it. I really enjoyed this film. I think there are some really clever aspects to it, especially when it comes to the husband Mark and showcasing how controlling he was and showing the extent that he's gone to make the situation uncomfortable and difficult for Emma. And I appreciated how it was a case of show me, not tell me, as you spot them dotted throughout the film as you're watching. I also liked the transition from metaphorically being chained to a dead weight to literally being chained to a dead weight. And the reason why it's right on the verge of worst and middle of the road is because some of the choices that they made in the film I just thought were really daft. I mean, the main one, the blatantly obvious one, is why was it necessary for Megan Fox, an already beautiful woman, to be constantly made up throughout the movie? I don't care how good your lipstick is, no one's lippy is staying on that long and through that many falls through the ice and crawling through muck and snow. Okay, so these next few movies on the list are ones that I neither love nor hate. They're the middle of the road movies around the 3-star marking. First up, we have The Conjuring 3, The Devil Made Me Do It. Paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren take on one of the most sensational cases of their careers. Accused of murder, the suspect claims demonic possession as his defence, forcing the Warrens into a supernatural inquiry unlike anything they've ever seen before. So this movie for me has to be the most middle of the road film of the year. It was just meh for me, and it's such a shame because I adore the first 2 Conjuring movies. I think that they are both masterpieces, and I do wonder if this drop in quality is down to the change in director. I mean, I'm not saying that Michael Chaves is a bad director, but this was a creation of James Wan's, and you know, it's just lacking his style that made the first 2 so good. Next up, we have Fear Street Part 1, 1994. After a series of brutal slayings, a teen and her friends take on an evil force that's plagued their notorious town for centuries. So the Fear Street trilogy created a lot of buzz in the horror community when it was released on Netflix last year. And when it came out, I, like a lot of people, found it really refreshing. This is the weakest in the trilogy, in my opinion. I think that it did a really good job in capturing the essence of the 90s. And I think that the homage to Scream in its cold open is absolutely wonderful. But apart from that, I just didn't really connect with this one. I found that this installment had the weakest characters, and I just didn't love the leading lady. Not the actress, but the character, because I enjoy her more in the 3rd installment when she plays a different character. So I think it was just the actual character itself, and because I found it hard to connect to my leading lady, it just lost me a little bit. So considering that R.L. Stine's books, a series of books, The Goosebumps, was an absolute staple of my childhood and was one of my earliest loves of horror, I was very surprised when I watched these Fear Street films and saw the level of gore in it. I mean, The bread slicing scene, the first time watching it, had my jaw on the floor. And next up we have Wrong Turn. Despite warnings to stick to the Appalachian Trail, hikers stray off course and cross into land inhabited by a hidden community of mountain dwellers who use deadly means to protect their way of life. Suddenly under siege, the friends seem headed to the point of no return, unless one man can reach them in time. So I really enjoy the original Wrong Turn. I think that it is a great early 2000s horror movie, but I haven't seen the sequels and I'm not a die-hard fan of the franchise. So when I read that they were going to go in a different direction and a different style with this reboot, remake, I wasn't really bothered by that. I didn't really mind. I do think though that it wasn't, once you've watched the film, I think you realise it's not necessary to actually call it a Wrong Turn movie, aside from it being set in the Appalachian Mountains. And talking of the mountains, I thought that this film had an absolutely stunning setting. And a few stupid decisions aside, I thought that the characters were pretty likeable for the most part, and the gore was on point. I mean, let's be honest, that's what you'd expect from a Wrong Turn movie. It's why most people watch them. It's for the carnage candy. Like I said, some of the character choices were just plain dumb. First of all, coming off of the trail. Coming off of the designated trail to safety. Don't do it. We've seen enough movies to know this doesn't go well. And the other one as well, which it really bugged me, and it still bugs me now. That's why I'm laughing, because it's so stupid. When the final girl is escaping, spoilers, from the settlement, and she goes through the cave and she stumbles upon her friend who has had his eyes removed, why can't she take him with her? Why does he have to die? He's only been there a little while. Surely he's savable. Surely just take him with you. You don't have to kill him. Okay, next we have Spiral from the Book of Saw. When a policeman is murdered by a jigsaw copycat killer, Zeke Banks is assigned to investigate the case. In the process of punishing the perpetrator, he ends up facing the demons of his past. Okay, let's be clear. I absolutely love the Saw franchise. The first film is one of my favourite horror films of all time, not least because it gave us the incredible talents of James Wan and Leigh Whannell, but I haven't seen Jigsaw and I don't really intend to, because based off of what I've heard, it just doesn't feel like it would feel like a Saw film, and that it isn't in keeping with the bonkers, over-convoluted story that I have come to know and love in the rest of the franchise. And while Spiral isn't technically a Saw film, it is under the same umbrella and it is set in the same universe. I mean, it is from the Book of Saw after all. The original people who were involved with Saw who worked on Spiral are obviously still very passionate about the Saw brand, and Chris Rock is both a huge horror fan and a huge fan of the Saw franchise. And all the behind the scenes footage that I watched with him, it was very evident that he showed a lot of care and a lot of respect to the franchise when being involved with Spiral. And so I think that this love and care for the brand really comes across in Spiral. There are plenty of nods to the original movies, and I loved that they blended the colour palettes of the original films with using blues and greens, but then with the new addition of reds and oranges, which was apparently meant to reflect the uncomfortable heat wave that was happening in the city. Spiral is not going to be for everybody. I mean, it's in the middle of the road section of this episode for a reason. It's not a perfect movie. It's not a great movie. It's not a great Saw movie. And all the flaws that people rightly point out, they're spot on. But I did have a good time with it. I enjoyed it and I would probably rewatch it. Even though in the first viewing I had figured out who the killer was, and so I missed out on that shock reveal, there was still enough in it for me to enjoy. None more so than the addition of Samuel L. Jackson in this movie, who is only in it about 10 minutes in total, maybe 15, and an absolute push, no, probably 10. But I would recommend this film to people, and I would rewatch this film purely for some of his lines. When he chews the line, Jigsaw copycat killer, and also the other one, so you want to play a game, do you, mother fluffer?
Jigsaw copycat.
It's like music to the ears. Next up, we have Old, which may prove to be another controversial choice. A family take a relaxing tropical holiday but discover that the secluded beach where they are relaxing is somehow causing them to age rapidly, reducing their entire lives into a single day. So I know that M. Night Shyamalan's movies are not for everybody. He has a very distinct style of filmmaking and is an acquired taste. I personally like some of his work. I like Signs and I like The Village, and I enjoyed Old as well. I think that the concept is really interesting. I think that the setting is really beautiful. And I went into this film with quite middling to low expectations because while I didn't know a great deal about the film itself, I did know that it was receiving a lot of negative reviews. I can understand why. Again, as much as I did enjoy this film, some of the acting is quite weak at times, and I think that some of the messages of the movie, they're not subtle. At some points, you're basically having it rammed down your throat, and that is not going to be for everybody. But I did enjoy it, and I think I would rewatch it, especially in the summer months when you really want that nice beach by the water setting. Okay, now the exciting bit. We are getting into the best horror movies that I watched in 2021. First up, we have Candyman. For decades, the housing projects of Chicago's Cabrini Green were terrorised by a ghost story about a supernatural, hook-handed killer. In present day, an artist begins to explore the macabre history of Candyman, not knowing it would unravel his sanity and unleash a terrifying wave of violence that puts him on a collision course with destiny. So I did give Candyman 3 stars, but I think it deserves better than just middle of the road. For one thing, it is a visually beautiful movie with some incredible sound design and cinematography. It has a really strong first act, and I really enjoyed when Anthony began to explore the tragic history of Cabrini Green. The scene where he walks around the original site of it is my favourite of the entire movie. This is where they really showcase that beautiful sound design and beautiful visuals. But as strong as the first act is, it is really let down by its really bad third act. I mean, this film is a very slow-paced movie, and it slowly builds up for what feels like forever, and then suddenly, boom, you are in the third act, and it has come out of nowhere, and then it's such a short third act that the movie's over before you've even really caught up with what's happening. This Candyman does play around with the legend of Candyman, the idea of it rather than being just one man, it's a hive of men that represent the repeated traumas that have happened throughout decades. And I think that overall, besides having a very messy ending to its film, I think that Candyman deserves to be in the best of the movies of 2021. Next up, we have Don't Tell a Soul. A security officer falls down a hidden well while chasing 2 teenage brothers who stole more than $12,000. Desperate to get out, he soon tries to convince one of the siblings to set him free and save his life. Okay, before you say it, I know that this is not a purebred horror film, it's more like a thriller with horror elements. But this is my list, and I decide that it has enough horror elements to deserve to be on here. I said in my Letterboxd recap for November that this wasn't exactly what I expected it to be going into it, even though I'm not really sure I could pinpoint what I was expecting. It has a really dark tone to it on multiple levels. The family that we follow is weighed down by financial worries, and the setting itself is literally really dull and depressing as it's overshadowed. The whole town setting is overshadowed by the pollution that is pumped out by the local power plant. I won't say too much more about the main core of the story because it's one of those films that has so much more to it than you originally realise or than what is explained in the synopsis. I'm a big fan of Rainn Wilson and Jack Dylan Grazer, and I think that this film gave them the opportunity to really show off their acting range, and I think that both of them delivered really strong performances, and the scenes of those two together bouncing off each other were my favourites of the whole movie. Next up, we have Fear Street Part 3, 1666. In 1666, a colonial town is gripped by a witch hunt that has deadly consequences for centuries to come, while teenagers in 1994 try to put an end to their town's curse before it is too late. So 1666 is the third and final instalment in the Fear Street trilogy, and in my opinion is an incredibly strong instalment. It is a hair width between this and 1978 as to my favourites. I loved the colonial setting, and even though I've heard some people complain about the same actors being used to play different characters, I really enjoyed it. I think it really gave it a depth of how this event in 1666 has weaved its way through the decades and through history, affecting these same families, affecting these same bloodlines. And I think that was part of how they tied it together really well. And as it jumped partway through, I think it's like 2/3 through the film, they jumped back to 94. I really think they did a good job of finding an enjoyable and satisfying conclusion to the overall story and wrapping everything up really, really well. And so next up we have Fear Street Part 2, 1978. Shadyside, 1978. School's out for summer and the activities at Camp Nightwing are about to begin. But when another Shadysider is possessed with the urge to kill, the fun in the sun becomes a gruesome fight for survival. So part 2 is my favourite part of the trilogy. But like I said, it is a hair width between part 2 and part 3. But this one, I just loved everything about it. I loved the master killer. I loved the setting. I loved the soundtrack. I mean, after the 60s, the 70s is my favourite decade for music. So very much enjoyed that. I thought Sadie Sink was fantastically cast as Ziggy. Ziggy, hands down my favourite character of the trilogy. And I just think that Sadie Sink is perfect at doing the angry, chip on the shoulder teenager, as we've seen as she plays Max in The Stranger Things. This is the one that I think I would revisit the most, especially in the summer months. Okay, so we have 4 films left, but these next 3 I found so difficult to rank. Honestly, they are all interchangeable with each other, and I think from minute to minute it changes which is my favourite out of the 3. So honestly, take the order of these next 3 films with a pinch of salt. Next up, we have Malignant. Paralysed by fear from shocking visions, a woman's torment worsens as she discovers her waking dreams are terrifying realities. So Malignant has to be the most polarising movie of 2021. People either seem to love it or really hate it. For me, I loved it. I absolutely love this strange little movie, and I think as well it's probably my favourite viewing experience of the year, purely for the journey that it took me on. It was like a wild roller coaster ride. It was everything I never knew I wanted in a horror movie, and it is just drenched in James Wan style and is such a visual treat for the audience as well. I won't say too much more about the film, especially the story, because just in case there are some of you watching this that haven't yet watched it, but I would highly recommend it. The only negative for me with it was there were some operation scenes. Not for me, but that is a me thing. That is not the movie's fault. Next up, we have A Quiet Place 2. Following the deadly events at home, the Abbott family must now face the terrors of the outside world as they continue their fight for survival in silence. Forced to venture into the unknown, they quickly realise that the creatures that hunt by sound are not the only threats that lurk beyond the sand path. So I am a newcomer to the Quiet Place movies. I watched the first one for the first time this year in preparation for part 2. And have been kicking myself ever since as to why it took me so long to watch this incredible movie. A Quiet Place, the first one, is hands down one of the most beautiful and moving horror movies I have ever seen. And for a sequel, this does a really good job. This is a really strong sequel, and I think this is in part, or largely in part, to John Krasinski continuing to helm this movie after he initially said that he wouldn't. And that is because he wanted the story and the characters to be treated properly. And I think that when a film is a passion project for people involved in it, it really does shine through and add just that extra level of something for the audience. In part 2, we see the addition of Cillian Murphy, who is a brilliant actor who is able to convey so much emotion through his facial expressions and his eyes, which is kind of perfect for a movie where character speech is limited. Next up, we have The Night House. Reeling from the unexpected death of her husband, Beth is left alone in the lakeside home he built for her. Disturbing visions of a presence in the house call to her, beckoning with a ghostly allure. But the harsh light of day washes away any proof of a haunting. Against the advice of her friends, she begins digging into his belongings, yearning for answers. So it's been a while since I've had a really good scare in a horror movie, and The Night House definitely delivered on that front. For a while, the film builds this misleading, calm tension with moments of eeriness, and in a split second, it changes to absolute terror. The Night House creates and plays around with some really interesting visuals, playing around with perception, mirror images, the use of red and blue, and overall it's just a film that really stays with you after you've watched it. You can't instantly forget about it. If I had to pick a negative, only one, it would be that in my opinion it goes on for slightly too long. And finally we have Last Night in Soho. An aspiring fashion designer is mysteriously able to enter the 1960s, where she encounters a dazzling wannabe singer. However, the glamour is not all it appears to be, and the dreams of the past start to crack and splinter into something far darker. So Last Night in Soho is an absolute masterpiece from Edgar Wright, and while it might not be considered the best or one of the best films by everybody, because it does have its flaws, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment, I just had such a personal journey with this film and connected with it on so many levels that it just hasn't left me since I watched it last month. And like the ghosts that haunt Eloise in the film and its characters and its soundtrack have just haunted me ever since I first watched it. I think that Matt Smith and Anya Taylor-Joy were perfectly cast as Jack and Sandy. These are just actors that perfectly encapsulate that classy, slick look of the 60s. And this is definitely one of those films that I'm going to revisit time and time again. I definitely will be buying this for my collection when it is released. But as much as I do love this movie, for me, the ending just doesn't work. It didn't sit with me while I was watching the film, and it still doesn't sit with me since watching the film. And I think that if you need a shock twist in the ending of your movie, maybe pick a different one. If you haven't watched the film yet, cover your ears for this next comment. We don't need to villainize the victim. We don't. Find a different ending, in my opinion. Okay guys, there you go, my ranking of the new horror movies that I watched in 2021 from worst to best. Like I said in the beginning, not all of them, but a fair few of them. My top 5 of the year would be Last Night in Soho, The Night House, A Quiet Place 2, Malignant, and Fear Street 1978. So what were your guys' favourite horror movies of 2021? I would love to know. I am definitely excited and ready to see what 2022 brings us now. I have already done an episode for my most anticipated horror of 2022, so if you haven't seen that yet, go and check that out. I'm also thinking of doing another episode a bit like this one, but just covering my favourite movies of 2021, including horror and non-horror, because let's be honest, we were treated to some absolute gems last year. So keep an ear out or an eye out for that one. But in the meantime, thank you as always for stopping by. I appreciate you all. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye guys.